Fire up that JP region BIOS, baby. It's time for the real Segaiden here on episode 73. あれか。あれを破壊すれば、ラティスは救われるんだな。With Tecmo's pals at Salio being the console's sole third-party publisher, and with Rygar, Bombjack, and Starforce having already appeared either on this console or the SG-1000, there was really only one possible candidate as Salio's next release to continue the Master System's mission of being the weird alternate reality version of the NES universe. That game, of course, is Solomon's Key, or as they call it in Japan, Solomon no Kagi. Honestly, the more I think about it, the weirder the whole Tecmo Salio thing seems to me. Like I said, Tecmo had put several games on SG-1000, but those actually appeared under license from Tekon, Tecmo's original name. The company reorganized and rebranded from Tekon to Tecmo somewhere between the December 1985 arrival of Bombjack and SG-1000 and Mighty Bombjack hitting the Famicom in April of 1986. That branding carried over into arcades, though, with June 1986's Rygar cabinet bearing the Tecmo name, so clearly this wasn't just a rebrand for the sake of publishing with Nintendo. So you'd think Tecmo would want to trumpet its new name far and wide, but then again, maybe Solomon's Key here is why they didn't. I mentioned last episode the well-known claim that Nintendo demanded exclusivity from third parties, something reported as far back as 1993 in David Sheff's Game Over. Supposedly, this exclusivity clause required publishers to put a given game only on NES and Famicom, or else give Nintendo a wholly unique rendition of that game. The latter certainly was the case for Rygar on NES and Mighty Bombjack. They were grand reimaginings of the arcade titles, full-on quests packed with character growth, exploration, collectibles, and secrets. But Solomon's Key here is almost entirely the same game as on NES. It looks a little nicer on Master System, sure, but both games feature, so far as I can tell, the same mechanics, objectives, and even stage layouts, all of which come from the arcade machine. Solomon's Key tells the tale of a little guy named Dana who has to run around a labyrinth of blocks. As is so often the case with little guys in labyrinths of blocks, he has the power to destroy most of the blocks. But Dana is no mere loadrunner, because he can also create blocks with impunity. Kind of like the Cane of Somaria in The Legend of Zelda. But it's not Somaria, it's Solomon. This power allows Dana to more or less completely reconfigure a stage's layout in order to make his way through it, creating steps and platforms so that he can reach his objectives in each level. He needs to make his way through to the exit, of course, because that's just what you do in video games. But he also needs to collect fairies who have been trapped within each stage, and to hunt for symbols of the zodiac that appear in certain places. All of these elements factor into Dana's various end-game goals, which, frankly, you'll never see because Solomon's Key is really difficult. Dana, as is often the case for little guys, only has the innate ability to create and destroy blocks. This does very little to prevent him from dying a grisly death in the jaws of the assorted monsters who live in the game world, and who try to take him out of the action for having the audacity to steal their zodiac jewelry, which, to be honest, is a fair cop. Sometimes you can destroy or create a block in such a way that it causes a critter to die, but mostly you need to avoid them. You can go full Fortunato on them by walling them up to take them out of the action, but really your best hope is to collect the power-up icons that you find occasionally throughout the rooms you clear, which gives you the ability to launch a single blast of flame that will skitter along continuous surfaces away from you, torching any baddie you encounter. These attacks do not recharge when you die, so you really have to make them count. And that makes this a very difficult game to clear. Developer iSystem Tokyo did at least have the courtesy of including a password feature in this version so that you can take a break and give it another go, but those only come up every few stages. In other words, they work just like on NES, which is to say, it works just about like pretty much everything else about this version of Solomon's Key, which is to say, just like the NES cart. A grim breach of contract. So maybe Salio came into play so that Tecmo could sell two versions of Solomon's Key without having to completely overhaul a game that worked perfectly well already. Honestly, its puzzle and collection systems work better on consoles than they did in the arcade. And putting out the same game under a different company's label gave Tecmo plausible deniability for violating Nintendo's exclusivity clause. Heck, we don't know. Ask those ruffians at Salio, they could shrug. Or maybe I'm just putting too much thought into this, and as I speculated last episode, Tecmo just didn't feel like dealing with the task of publishing on a dying platform. But then, why put games on Mark III to begin with at all? None of this matters, I know, but the Tecmo-Salio duo is such a weird little blip in Sega history that it really gets under my skin. To quote the wisdom of the legendary bard Jerome Seinfeld, what's the deal with that? Hey, remember back in NES Works when I misremembered the arcade version of Gyrus as having a rotary dial controller, even though it actually used a stick? Well, someone at Sega had my back, because Galactic Protector plays basically like someone said, what if Gyrus did use a rotary dial, and also starred Opa-Opa? Yes, despite not wearing the name Fantasy Zone, Galactic Protector is the fourth and final outing of Opa-Opa on the Mark III. So that's a double whammy for US localization prospects. Americans don't love Opa-Opa nearly as much as they should, and neither Sega of America nor Tonka released the Mark III's dial controller, previously seen in Woody Pop and Alex Kidd BMX Trials, in the US. We were destined never to see this game. And that's fine, actually. Galactic Protector is another one of those Sega home releases. Feels like it should have been a bonus minigame in a bigger, more complex title. The Master System had no shortage of these things, and as we've seen in our survey of the American side of the console's history, Sega largely began to move away from those over the course of 1988 in favor of meatier, original works like Segaiden. That's not a knock against the concept or execution of Galactic Protector, mind you, it's just that it feels incredibly slight, like a pre-crash cartridge game with spiffier graphics and music. You certainly can't fault Galactic Protector on charm. In keeping with its Fantasy Zone heritage, it packs a lot of personality into its world. For once, that doesn't really have much to do with Opa-Opa, who doesn't get to ramble about this time around. Opa-Opa has been bound to different planets, which he needs to protect by zapping incoming invaders and threats. So in this case, he pretty much just functions as a gun that spins around each planet firing outward into space. Likewise for his brother Opa-Opa, in the two-player mode that Sega clearly designed Galactic Protectors to be. Now let's pause for a moment and marvel at the wild hubris of that choice. You can't play Galactic Protector without the Mark III's rotary controller. So imagine thinking that you would ever somehow manage to get two humans who actually owned that peripheral into the same physical space. Unbelievable. The dial controller does work pretty well here though. Creatively, it was the right call, if not necessarily a wise choice in terms of publishing an accessible cartridge that anyone could just pick up and play with no additional investment into the Mark III ecosystem. Opa-Opa rotates around a succession of planets which have been besieged by assorted cosmic menaces that want to smash into the planets and destroy them. The planets themselves are defenseless on their own, capable only of hanging in space and mugging goofily. So they rely on Opa-Opa to fight off the alien hordes. You need to ride out wave after wave of attacker without allowing them to collide with the planet so many times that it wears down the world's health meter, and without Opa-Opa running into them himself. In other words, Galactic Protector gives you two vectors in which to achieve a game over failure, losing all three of Opa-Opa's lives or allowing a planet to be destroyed. Honestly, it seems pretty hopeless at first glance. The rotary controller gives you great precision and zippy analog speed as you defend each world, with its one limitation being the lack of free spin. You need to bear in mind the physical limits of the dial's rotation so that you don't hit one extreme, leaving yourself open to attack while rushing to zap an intruder. But even with the advantage of the rotary controller, Opa-Opa is pretty outmatched here. Enemies tend to appear in groups of 2 or 3, and they generally make a quick beeline for the planet until Opa-Opa crosses their path, at which point they'll pull back and begin orbiting, looking for another attack opening. So you need to plan around disrupting their movements while also firing and trying to avoid enemies that move in too close to the planet, since Opa-Opa will lose a life anytime he collides with an invader. Some attackers use unpleasant bonus tactics too, like the bubbles that shatter when struck by Opa-Opa's fire and cause multiple enemies to spill out. It's far too much for Opa-Opa to handle on his own. However, once you collect your first power-up, the game becomes remarkably less daunting. Every once in a while, a little black hole-looking thing will drift in toward the planet. If you manage to snag this before it achieves Earthfall, it becomes a sort of Gradius option-alike, doubling up Opa-Opa's fire and stacking to eventually become 3 rapid shots. It's pretty tough to hit moving enemies with a single little piddly bullet while spinning rapidly around a planet in the center of the screen. but hitting moving enemies with a triple-wide bullet stream, well, that's some Geordie LaForge meme material right there, my friends. Heck, for all we know, Geordie is the one who sent the option upgrade drifting into Opa-Opa's orbit in the first place. He probably rerouted the EPS conduits to fire a tachyon burst from the forward deflector array that creates a time-displaced double of Opa-Opa or something, because that's just the kind of guy he is. Once you pick up an option alike, Galactic Protector goes from being overwhelming to something of a cakewalk. You can breeze pretty easily through the first and second loops of the game, each of which sees you defending 3 different planets before starting back at Earth again. In classic Sega style, however, I don't think you're meant to be able to play past level 9 or 10 or so. That's the point at which you hit the stage, which opens with incredibly fast enemies that dart into the planet from multiple directions before you even have a chance to orient yourself and respond. You may recall from my SG-1000 retrospectives that a lot of Sega's games for that platform featured a massive difficulty spike at around level 10, including Sega Galaga and Flicky. This simply serves to reinforce the feeling that Galactic Protectors is a bit of a holdover from Sega's early console development days, rather than a work in keeping with the evolving design ethos of 1988. I mean, Galactic Protector postdates Phantasy Star in Japan. I really think there's no going back to the old ways after publishing something like that. So I guess that makes this another little blip in Sega history. The Fantasy Zone game that wasn't. It's not even an especially essential pickup for the 3 or 4 hardcore Fantasy Zone collectors of the world. Yeah, it stars Opa-Opa, but aside from that and the goofy expressions on the planet's faces, nothing about this really screams Fantasy Zone in the way that Fantasy Zone The Maze did. Next time on Segaiden, a few more Japan-exclusive stragglers. Can you handle this excitement?